Water and cups.
Oh, yeah, great, excellent.
How do you prefer to work at the? Well, is it?
I don't know. I'll probably work with some sort of the notes will be the same as the PowerPoint thing, but
Okay.
got stuff written on, so I'll probably use those.
Yeah. Okay. All your gears on there?
Beautiful. Okay. Hang on, it's not come up.
No, that's okay.
Oh, that's okay.
We can solve that for you.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, just turn it off while you're doing the introduction. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're... Okay, welcome to the first panel session for day 2. What we're going to do is we'll run through each of the speakers and then have questions at the end, I think, and the speakers are quite happy to do that. In order of appearance, we've got Bob Smith from management at Monash Uni. We have Peter van Onselen from Edith Cowan over in WA, and John Marshall from University of Technology, Sydney. To kick off with, we've got Bob to talk about centralisation and flexibility. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Michael. My interest in this is that when one as a citizen looks at the internet, one sees a multitude of choices, and we've had excellent speakers over the last few days talking about that. What pricked my interest particularly, and this was as a government official some time ago, I was involved in paying large amounts of other people's money for computer systems which often didn't work, and got interested therein in the issue of governance, of ICT as it's now called, following Peter Weil. And this paper is about whether there's a tension between what governments have to do to make their systems stand up and what people as citizens are expecting to do in and around governments and what they're expecting governments to assist them with. I should say at the outset also that this paper was commissioned by IPA, ACT and NOE and will appear in a publication that they're launching next week, so I'm grateful to them for sponsorship. So my starting points are, first of all, how do e-government projects ensure that initiatives complement each other? This might sound an old-fashioned question, but for a person of my age, it's where we started, with lots of people doing very interesting things which didn't add up. Second, do flexible and integrated services depend on central management of ICT? Is it possible to join everything up by bubblegum, as a noted Canadian has said recently? Or do we end up with a situation where we've got lots of things that are a bit like a dog skating on lino or a kitchen floor, having been told to bugger off, and not finding his energy is translating into forward motion? And how are tensions managed between encouraging innovation and centralising management? Now, I'm taking it for the purpose of this paper that that's a real question. By the end of the session, you may be able to persuade me, and I'll be happy to be persuaded that I've asked the wrong question, but I'm sticking it out there to see what people think. The spine of the argument comes through 4 propositions. First of all, what we're seeing is governance in ICT reasserts whole of government strategies. In business, it's whole of enterprise strategies. This has come through extremely strongly. The significance of this is that we've been through a period in government where we tried to deal with complexity in government by cutting things up. The neoliberal formulations, the NPM formulations, gave us apparently clear-eyed, sharp-edged formulations for cutting government up. What we're now seeing, post-neoliberal wave, post-NPM, is a tendency for people to reinvent the whole of government idea. Now again, to betray my age, I first heard whole of government in the early 1970s. So my God, the surf is coming in again after 30 years. With it, a whole lot of issues which people didn't solve in the 1970s, so watch this space. The second is that a focus on integrated services and more community-oriented government demands whole-of-community strategies. We're seeing in the work portrayed in this conference by the Queensland Government, and we're seeing in the work coming out of the Department for Victorian Communities in this state, a resurgence of interest in community and in trying to understand the whole of community. So my second proposition is that as we get into integrated services and more community-oriented government, we're on a path that takes us into holistic but so far indeterminate territory, and we may not necessarily be comfortable with what we find. The third point is that, following Jane Fountain and the idea that technology reconfigures bureaucracy rather than gets rid of it, I can see the possibility of a tension between reconfigured bureaucracy and citizen-centred government. One sees whispers of this in some of the literature, one sees whispers of this in people's experience, and my proposition is we should take this seriously. And the fourth point is perhaps we need to start talking about forums to bridge debates about ICT governance in government and wider community expectations. So context. The scope of e-government initiatives is expanding. E-government agendas are merging with wider agendas about the role and scope of government. We're seeing this in a lot of the most recent government reform literature and in a lot of the most recent e-government literature. comes through quite strongly, for example, in the work of Dunleavy and Margetts, which has been cited earlier in the conference. There's a renewed emphasis, as I said, on pragmatism and responsiveness. The idea of public value is coming through quite strongly in discussion in this country as it is in the United States and the UK. And there's a renewed emphasis on that old-fashioned thing, learning and adaptiveness. The way in which different agendas can intermingle is quite nicely put by this diagram, which I've pinched from March and McNiven, two Canadian scholars, and they've tried to bridge the e-government, e-governance divide, which has concerned some scholars and which has perhaps been reflected in some of the sessions of this conference. And the point that I'm making is that I follow March and McNiven's argument that whether we like it or not, whether we start with e-governance or e-government, we end up converging in places that are a little different from where we thought we might have been starting. And for people inside government thinking about e-government, the suggestion is, hey, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to find yourselves talking about community with people in the community who've got very different views about what they want from you than what you've got that you want to tell them. The approach is not, unfortunately, based on research. It's based on literature, and these are the people I've looked at. I went first of all to Jane Fountain's book, Building the Virtual State, because of the depth of her work on organisation behaviour and because of the very strong case studies that she's looked at. The points that she made, and you'll all be familiar with them, the results of enacted technology are unpredictable. Reconfiguring bureaucracy gets us back into hard old things like analysing what we actually need and inter-organisational collaboration. When someone says that you can do that and proves it by electronic means, there'll be a collective sigh as a whole lot of organisation theorists go bankrupt. And I was particularly taken by Fountain's argument that there's a need for intersecting research on collaboration and networks, and for how computing in government ties in with, merges with, energises the organisational structure and process of bureaucracy, reconfigured or otherwise. And of course that's a two-way process. Now, Fountain's work has received a lot of accolades, but has received quite a few brickbats. One is that she reinvented the wheel. The other is that she's just looked at a particular number of federal cases, and the real action is at state and local level in the United States, as it perhaps is here. Short time span for some of the cases. In other words, the story hadn't fully developed by the time she had written her book. The idea of a dialectical sequence, this comes from David Garson, in particularly the ITDS, the customs case that Fountain's examined, and Garson said, well, look, let's look at what happened after Fountain stopped writing about it, and there was a zigzag path. And then finally, Andrew Chadwick from the UK has argued that she was curiously narrow in her focus and that she didn't look at the potential fusion between administrative reform and democratisation. That, I think, has become much plainer than when Fountain was doing her research. And my argument here is that while Fountain didn't pick that up, what she puts in her book is indispensable for anyone wanting to pursue that course now, as I would argue is a very worthwhile thing to do. So what we see was we moved from Jane Fountain to management scientists Peter Weil and Michael Vitale, is that hierarchy and flexibility seem to join in a challenging but intimate dance, and that whatever we're doing in government or in business, we're having to work our way through incumbent, existing, sometimes difficult to penetrate institutions. And Weil and Vitale set this out for business in a way that no one in public management or public policy would be going to do. They really focus on the centralisation, and they bring out a sense of paradox that in order to get the flexibility at the operating level that you want, you've got to have very tight control at the centre. And in government, if, following the Canadians, government is an enterprise of enterprises, then Weil and Vitale's puzzles are magnified perhaps geometrically inside government. Now, I take these perspectives into a review of a couple of cases in Michigan and Victoria, and I don't have time to do more than say the bottom thing there. The pathways through were zigzag. Just to mention a little bit about Michigan, Governor John Engler, a Republican, neoliberal type governor, poured on the political octane. Good short-term results, long-term results, burnt off, pretty ambiguous. Similarly in Victoria, political octane went on, Black's government changed political direction, and now we've got centralisation of ICT strategy coming through very strongly in Victoria, as I'll mention in a moment. So certainly not a straight through, nice linear path. In this quotation from Weil, Subramanian and Broadbent, what comes through is that we're dealing with commodities, we're dealing with things as banal as a plastic cup or something like that. But putting it together, now that's the trick. Weil and Vitale set out 6 governance archetypes, and I commend those to you. What they say is that you have to pick archetypes that will work, trick question, do that at the firm level and at all business unit levels. There's got to be correspondence. There's a real linearity in Weil's thinking. You can mix and match your archetypes. Anything except anarchy and feudalism will work. But as you do your mixing and matching, you've got to march through a long chain of transactions, which means taking the whole organisation with you. So you're looking for clarity and decisiveness over a long chain. So whilst 4 archetypes that work entail going into a long chain of transactions which in government, as in big business, can be vigorously contested for all sorts of reasons. So, towards a whole-of-government approach, the OECD, those master practitioners of the ultra-diplomatic, take a more coordinated approach. Canada, a good model, comes up in all of the surveys near the top of the range in e-government. Central CIO stuck in the Treasury Board Secretariat. Focus on citizens, a lot of focus group work to find out what people are looking for. Congruent focus on productivity and transparency. A lot of concern on technical things, interoperability and integration. Canada seems to be a bit of a model, and we see some of the Canadian logic and some of the OECD injunctions followed through in Victoria, where now we have a CIO and a Cabinet and Senior Officers Committee looking at IT. The problem with all of this is that in government, key strategies often compete. So strong central coordination burns scarce political resources. People found that in the 1970s, and we'll be reading about that with ICT governments before the year is out. Innovation often stalls without a pluralistic environment. Federated strategies impose high transaction costs. So if you go into those, you may find that you take a long way to nowhere. And there's a contingency about attempts at balance. However, other agendas will not wait. People are looking for integrated services within and between jurisdictions. People are not happy just with transactions. Renewing something online, registering your cat online, is not a particularly flash experience. There are wider demands for participation and openness. The Canadians are noting, and I think we will note, that e-government and e-governance puts further pressure on our tight Westminster systems. So we've got leapfrogging agendas, whole of government, whole of community, communities and governments in the world. Intermingling of agendas of e-government and e-governance increases pressure on governments. Tight governance of ICT infrastructure does not mesh easily with increased public participation. So perhaps we get to the final point, that creating forums that link management and government to wider community expectations is just the first step, but an extremely essential step. Thank you.
Beautiful use of time, Bob. Now we've got, just reset here. Peter Van Onselen. Sorry, Peter, I should have been practicing this.
Not exactly in keeping with an electronic governance conference, but I'm not going to use the overheads for this, but I do have copies of the paper if anyone's interested at the end of it. What I'm looking at is voter tracking software, which is essentially, in Australia, in the context of Australia, the databases that both major political parties operate for their election campaigning and for their in-between election campaign period. And I want to look at it over the next 20 minutes in sort of three primary areas. Firstly, I'll go through the background to their development. Secondly, I'll look at the actual design of these databases, how they're put together, and some comparisons between the two parties. And finally, sort of problems and associated reforms with how they can be changed. In terms of what they are, voter tracking software, the databases, the Liberal Party call their database Feedback, and the Labor Party call their database Electrac, used to be called Pollfile. Now, what these databases essentially are is they're a means that the parties use to increase their ability to communicate effectively with electorates, individual member electorates, but also to a certain extent the Central Party uses these databases to communicate with wider audiences. But the biggest thing that they allow them to do is that they allow them to target individual constituents in a more precise way, and I'll get to that when I go through the design mechanisms that the software within these databases allows them to do. But in terms of their background and their development, both databases really were developed as a result of learning information obtained from overseas. The Liberal Party primarily learnt theirs from the United States of America, and the Labor Party's originated out of Canada, with connections from both parties with associated parties in each of these countries. And what the databases allow them to do, in terms of this background, is it allows them to improve their communication skills with each of us, I guess, all of us in this room, depending on what electorate we're in. It allows them to find out more about us, and then to try to target what they say to us in their literature, or if they do phone polling, that kind of thing. It allows them to appeal more to what each of us takes an interest in. So it's all about them compiling information as much as they can on each one of us and then relaying that back to us, ultimately, obviously, in the political process, with the aim of convincing each one of us to vote for them. Now, the Liberal Party developed theirs later than the Labor Party. The Labor Party's developed after 1983 when Bob Hawke came in federally, and there was this real feeling in the party that they'd spent so much time at a federal level in opposition rather than in government, and something needed to reform, some sort of professionalisation of their political practice needed to develop. The Liberal Party's really developed after 1990, and when I say developed, I'm talking about the software really being increasingly harnessed. They did have more basic forms of direct mail techniques prior to these times. But 1990 was the key date for the Liberal Party because it was at this time that they lost a federal election, even though they obtained more than 50% of the two-party preferred vote. And they saw this as a problem. They realised that there was an increased need for them to do more professional campaigning, if you like, in the individual member electorates. So how are they actually designed? How do they get this information on each one of us? There are two forms of information that they're trying to ultimately identify. One is issue-based interests that each of us have, and the other one is voting intentions. Now, obviously, voting intentions is a much more difficult thing to try to obtain information about. Issue-based interest is easier. How do they obtain this information? Partly, and I have to say just as a caveat here, my knowledge on this is greater on the Liberal side than it is on the ALP side. But I do believe from interview evidence that I've obtained from staffers and politicians on both sides that the systems are largely the same, but there are some differences. In terms of how they obtain this information, the Australian Electoral Commission provides both or all political parties that have the representation within the area of an elector with some basic information about us. they get are address, date of birth, occupation is an optional entry on AEC information, which roughly half the voters choose to fill out, and that is also on this information. Telephone numbers are obtained by harvesting them in from telephone directories. And they also have the ability through the AEC to gain, sometimes to gain some sort of ethnic holding as well, because immigration is an issue that is obtained through the AEC as well, whether you are a migrant or not. Now, this is the basic information that the parties have on all of us, but they want to build on that. They want to build on that about issues so that they can send direct mail out to us about an issue that we may be concerned about that. But then they also obviously want to try to create a voter intention, whether we are a swinging voter or a strong or a soft voter to either side of the political divide. And the way they go about doing this is, and this is where the databases and the technology within the databases help allow them to really feed on themselves. Because if they do an electorate-wide mail-out, for example, they can have something like a questionnaire that is attached to the information that they send out. Now, they can try to obtain information back based on that questionnaire if it's not anonymous, obviously. But what they can also do, and this is where the difference between the level of professional practice that the technology has the potential to allow for versus sometimes the reality of how it operates. And the reality is that these databases tend to operate more effectively, in my experience, in marginal electorates than they do in safe electorates, just simply because the need is there in the marginal electorates to get more information about voters as best they can. But the way that they can obtain information, for example, is a simple door knocking expedition. Many people may have had their local Member of Parliament come door knocking. If they do that, it's quite often not a random door knock. These electoral databases allow them to print one side of the street at a time, up in terms of who lives where, and they can have files in front of them where they actually have the information on who lives at that address, possibly your occupation. If you've got that on the electoral enrolment form, that'll help to kick-start conversation. Now, information can be obtained from these door-knocking experiences that can then be fed back into the database system to help narrow what it is that the particular electors at that address have an interest in. Now, if you send correspondence to an MP's office, it's estimated that roughly 5% of an electorate correspond with an MP's office during the course of an electoral cycle, generally. That information can then be logged into the database system about you, no matter what the issue is that you're writing in about. If you take an interest in a local community paper or a community organisation where your views are publicly available, it is conceivable that a well-run professional electorate office will be able to download that information into their database system. So if you've written a letter, for example, to a local newspaper expressing a concern about a particular issue, they can look you up using your name in their electoral database and tag that information in against your name. Now, how much this happens in practice is something that is questionable, but I would argue over the last 10 years it is increasingly happening, and as I said, more so certainly in the marginal seats. That's one way that they can do it. The other one is they have caller identification. Using your phone number that you are calling from, if you call from home, to have a rant at your local Member of Parliament but don't want to leave your details, that information can then be tagged into the system, even if you intended the call to be anonymous but made the call from home. Now, this might initially seem incredibly invasive to a lot of people, but there are positive sides to it as well. I mean, the title of the paper is The Dark Side of Democracy, but I don't think it's all bad. I think that there is an enormous amount of representative good that can come out of these electoral databases, because at the end of the day, they do provide Members of Parliament with the capacity to better communicate with their electorate and ultimately, therefore, to better represent their electorate. I think there's no question about that. But what I take issue with, and Wayne Errington, who we wrote the paper together, what we take issue with at the moment is the lack of mechanisms that are in place in terms of regulating this information. And that's really, I think, the problem at the moment, because the parties, for a plethora of reasons, aim to keep this information very secretive. At the first level, they certainly keep it very secretive because of the competitive nature of it. Both political parties have databases. They don't ostensibly collude openly with those databases because they are in competition with each other. But they collude implicitly with each other insofar as the rules of the game that are there for the use of these databases. And I'll get to that in a moment. So, you know, that's one reason why it's not highly open. But the other one is, I guess, the sort of the Big Brother-esque fear factor that these databases might stir up in terms of people's emotions. So parties aren't interested to date in this information being publicly available, or indeed talking very much about it on the record. I've found when talking to members of Parliament, a number of them are quite happy to talk to me about the issues, but it's almost always got to be off the record. It's not something that the party secretariats want their MPs to discuss, and it's certainly not something that gets much airtime in questions on notice in Parliament or in general discussion through the media either. So what problems ensue, I guess, is the question in terms of the limited openness of these systems. Well, the first one is partly their design. At the moment, in Australia, having a compulsory voting system, this essentially means that AEC, Australian Electoral Commission data on each of us, we have to fill that out, and the political parties get access to it. So in other words, there is no individual right there amongst voters to exclude themselves from this database information, which gets fed directly in to the major parties that hold the seats. So even if one of us wanted to be excluded, the same way, for example, we might want to be excluded when we have a silent telephone number, we don't have that option with this information going to the political parties. We can't exclude ourselves from this. Our date of birth, well, occupation we don't have to fill out, but our date of birth, our address and our name go straight to the parties, and there is nothing we can do about that. Yes? It's possible to have your phone number taken off it, and you can request to have your name taken off it, but there's no legislative requirement that they have to take your name off of it. And that's part of the issue. And this is, I'll get straight to that now. Part of that has to do with the fact that the rules that they're set up under are essentially, it's the Privacy Amendment Act of 2000. The Privacy Amendment Act of 2000 brought in a rule, or brought in legislation, that meant that private organisations could not compile information about individual citizens without their consent. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but in essence that was the gist of it. Now, political parties excluded themselves from this Privacy Amendment Act, even though they are themselves private organisations technically. So the political parties who passed the legislation through the upper house through the lower and upper house of the federal parliament, excluded themselves from this legislation to therefore allow their databases to continue to operate. So you as an individual don't actually have the right to access anything that is in your database system on you. And if you get in touch with the Australian Electoral Commission, which I think is more back to your question, to try to have yourself taken off the list, firstly, you have to provide just cause for why that is the case. Police officers, for example, aren't on AEC data lists for obvious reasons. But you have to provide just cause. Otherwise, you don't actually have that right, is my understanding. But even if that were to change, which is obviously very heavily against political party interests, one of the problems is that there isn't enough discussion about this for most people to even be aware of these mechanisms that may be in place. So you've got the Privacy Amendment Act, which parties are excluded from. Yet at the same time, if any of us want to look at this information and gain further information about what the parties have on us, we can't use things like, for example, freedom of information to try to do a search on ourselves. Parties don't actually have to give across what information they have compiled on us because, one, they're a private organisation, so they're exempt from FOIs, but on the flip side, even though they're a private organisation, they've exempted themselves from the Privacy Amendment Act 2000 that would otherwise make these databases illegal, essentially. So that's the way that they're set up. But the problems that come from this, and this is where I'm more talking, certainly from my own experience from having done some political staffing before I went into academia, is that there are not regimented training organisations in place for ethical guidelines for staffers to use this material. A lot of the information that gets logged is just wrong. One example of that is when I was an undergrad, there was some parkland that was being named after Paul Keating, and I just wrote a smart-ass letter in to the Sydney Morning Herald, just saying, "Is the park a wasteland of economic mismanagement?" And that, it's just sort of a one-line letter that went in. Now, when I later ended up working for a Liberal politician, I was, incorrectly tagged in their database system as being a strong Liberal voter, just because of this letter. And because I looked myself up, I was tagged as being a strong Liberal voter. Now that was just incorrect. So there's a real issue here. I mean, we live in a sort of safe democracy, so it might sound a little bit melodramatic, but at the end of the day, the capacity for information to be logged and logged in correctly is a real issue, and there aren't guidelines in place that I can see by either party, not effective guidelines, to ensure that information is accurately logged. For example, staffers that log information don't have a personal identification of themselves for that information that gets logged. So there is no way of seeing who has changed information that goes into the system, or indeed which individual in an electorate office did change that information along the way. So there's issues of openness in that respect. So in terms of reforms that are available, Wayne and I have suggested, and this is in the paper in obviously a lot more detail, we've suggested some basic things like the right of an individual voter to be able to check their own information, the importance of something like the Electoral Commission that oversees these databases and that has access to them to ensure that guidelines are in place, and improved training situations within political parties. For example, the Liberal Party's database feedback, in their database manual, they actually have a clear line that advises their staff to be sure and not show this information to electors, even if they ask for it. Now, that is actually in their feedback manual as a guideline for staffers in terms of operating this information. So I think it needs to be a lot more open. I mean, obviously there's a requirement there from a competitive sense for the political parties that they're going to need a certain amount of privacy with this information that is compiled, because it is very partisan. But there are real question marks over the use of publicly funded apparatuses to be able to use these database systems, for example. They tend to operate out of electorate offices. So immediately you've got taxpayer-funded staffers that do use them. In the case of the Federal Liberal Party, the Government Members Secretariat, which is a taxpayer-funded body in the Federal Parliament, they do a lot of the staff training on how to use the database system. And again, that's taxpayer-funded. So there's a large amount of taxpayer dollars going into their operation, but very little accountability structures that are in place for public interest. And I think that's a real issue. Just as a last point, a somewhat anecdotal one, this is something that I found in my research along the way, and this only applies to the Liberal Party. But I know, and I don't know if it happens in the ALP, I haven't had a chance to check that, but the AEC have a real issue with postal voting, with the way that it's currently structured. The problem that they see about that is that both major parties essentially run the postal votes through themselves. Both parties send everyone a how to vote, postal application form. You write back to one of the parties that you choose to write back to, then you get sent the actual postal vote form. Now, the Liberal Party log people that write back to them as being likely Liberal voters. And they do this because they assume that if you choose to write back to them rather than the other side of politics, they assume that immediately gives them potentially a voter identification. They put you as a more likely Liberal voter if you write back to a Liberal candidate when the sitting member is an ALP, because they've determined anecdotally that means that it's probably more likely that you are, even more likely therefore, that you are a Liberal voter. And I think that's just one sort of anecdotal example of problems that exist in the system, which overlaps with postal vote applications in that respect as well. Thank you.
Before I whiz it on. Thanks, Peter. A very interesting story, but also impressive in the sense of no PowerPoint. But the last time I saw someone speak for that amount of time with cue cards behind the eyelids, I think it was Tony Giddens some time ago. It's really, I must say, incredibly impressive. John Marshall now. You ready, John? We'll just... Hey. And we'll get you. Do you like the room a bit lighter?
No, that'll be fine.
Is you right?
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Okay. This paper's yet another paper on an entirely different subject. So, anyway, I also want to say that some of what I'm going to say is going to be pretty basic, because my readers had difficulty understanding what I meant by governance. Okay? So, first of all, I want to say the obvious things. Okay, when people do governance studies, they're usually abstract, they're usually large scale, they usually tend to be top-down rather than multidimensional. It's been quite obvious, even when people have been saying we mustn't be top-down, they've been saying, well, what can we do about it? Okay, and the usual cliches are about the internet being a public space with free, plentiful education, and that access is an issue, and that education will solve everything, and so on. Okay, Now, what I'm saying is that to actually do anything at all about e-governance, we actually need to examine how interactions have grown up online, the kinds of ways that people actually go about governing themselves, the kinds of ways that people go about having arguments, and so on. So, in my view, we need an ethnographic study of governance in action online. And I would say also that people have been saying that, you know, that there's the way that the state has retreated from various things. And one of the things that could be interesting to people is that there's been a hell of a lot of work in anthropology over the last 80 years on governance in stateless societies, the way that people run things without formal authorities, and the way that people get a kind of what you might call interactive democracy going in all kinds of different ways. Okay, now governance itself is a vague term, which sometimes means that it's used for magic purposes. Part of its reason for being is that it has no meaning. Okay, so you can use it to mean whatever you want it to mean, and also it tends to be very much value driven. People talk about governance as being good governance, but if you're actually going to study stuff, you have to study stuff irrespective of whether you think it's good or bad. And like, for instance, if there's a question about something and you think, well, this is irrelevant to the government process, it may not be irrelevant to the government process. Like someone was saying that a list that they were studying was full of people writing about completely irrelevant stuff, but that may be part of the actual phenomenology of the way that that particular list or any other list works, okay? Now also one of the things that has happened with the term governance, and there's been quite a bit of work on this, is that it often involves the incorporation of business as an explicit driving force or model for the way that things should be run. So again, the value terms getting into things. And so you see things like the backing of rights of capital over citizens, the idea that the state is withdrawing from people. I mean, people here have been saying the state, that we are withdrawing from the state, but in some ways the state is withdrawing as a mode of help to people while still maintaining its mode of regulation over people. Another thing about governance is that it is often a way of saying that responsibility is somewhere else because there's no particular person or whatever responding. So what I'm going to use governance for is to talk about what happens when you have a whole series of multiplicities of actors. And I'm going to say that different cultures, different situations within a particular society can all have different modes of governance. There's no reason to expect that there's any coherence anywhere. Okay, and in fact it may be useful to study the different ways that governance works. So, for me, governance means the way that the groups come to govern themselves to maintain group identity, the way they come to decisions, the way that they use power, the ways that they act as a group, the ways that they engage in social control over each other. And so one of the questions becomes, what kinds of structures, situations, affects the ways that people can govern themselves online or interact with other people? Okay, so the main themes for this paper is that the way that governments operate is online influenced by three main factors. One is the organisation of communication, the way that communication is actually structured for people to use. This is the most visible kind of structuring of people, and that obviously has to do with technical factors, but it also has to do with organisational factors, which we'll talk about more. Then there's existential issues of being online, which I'll talk about a bit more later. And then finally, there's the way that offline factors are mobilised. And this is usually, but not always, through rhetorical deployment, through using particular kinds of marked symbolic categories to put your arguments or to classify other people so that their arguments will be seen in particular kinds of ways, or ways that you can reincorporate action in offline life. So as someone else was saying earlier, often if you don't have any kind of existent social organisation already, then having things on the internet does not make any particular difference. It has to be grounded in something that's external to the actual list or mode of communication itself. Okay, so looking at the organisation of communication. Okay, as I've said, potential modes of governance change with the way that communication is organised, the way that power can be manoeuvred. This kind of includes things like who can be blocked,
who can do the actual blocking of other people's speech, who can speak or write, how people make contact, what kinds of modes of exchange are engaged in. Is the exchange from one person to lots of people? How do you control someone who keeps giving things that the other group, the readers may not want, and so on. As you all know, there are main ways of doing this: mailing lists, MUDs, news groups, blogs, standard websites. All of them have particular ways that they structure the communication that you can engage in, and so the kinds of politics that can be engaged in using them. Okay, you also need to look at the way that groups can interact online. It's quite frequently the case that groups will have quite a coherent identity, but they will not be able to act as a group with other groups. Now, this is very rare offline, because quite often people will interact as groups with other groups, but that means that in some ways there is no sort of contrast. So it's not simply that people have their membership diffused upon a whole lot of different groups, but they don't necessarily have the contrast of acting together as a group with other groups. Okay, so there's also existential issues of being online. The first one, which I call essence, is a suspension of being. And what that means is basically that you online do not know you exist until somebody responds to you. You haven't got the normal ways of interacting with a person so that you can change what you're saying compared to their interaction. If their eyes go glazed, you can change what you're saying, you can multiply it, you can alter it so that they become interested. You don't even know if anybody's listening to you. You don't know if the people that you are trying to mobilize, they might not be on that particular forum at that time. You may feel that your ideas are rejected simply because the people are elsewhere. Okay? And this, in some way, if this is true, that this is a fundamental fact of being online, then it goes against the idea of simple presence, that you can be simply co-present with other people online. You, in fact, are never simply co-present in the sense that you are if you are sitting in a room with other people, because there's no marker of your existence other than the Communication Act. Okay, one of the other things that's always seemed to be important to me is the issues of authenticity, because it's often said that, of course, that people online have multiple personalities and all this kind of stuff. But in fact, if you actually look at the way that people behave online, what they are trying to do often is find out the reality of the people that they're interacting with. They want to find out what it is they really believe in, what it is that they really exist in, and that nearly always means that you have to relate the person themselves to some kind of offline or off-group communication, so that people will tend to regard that as being more genuine and actually tell them more about you and what you believe in. And hence, if there are anonymous people on the list, that can be actually quite threatening to many people, even those people who will say that you don't have to have a particular kind of identity. Okay, you all know about Flame, but I would also say that one of the things that Flame is actually reflecting is the level of essence. A good way of proving that you exist is getting a response from somebody. And if you do that by being rude in a large group, and again this comes off the structure of the communication, then the more people that there are that have only tenuous contact with you, the more likelihood that somebody will respond and actually prove that you exist. So you get a kind of positive feedback state, and it's got nothing to do with people's levels of aggression or being freed up or anything like that. It has simply to do with the fact that you don't exist. Okay, so skipping some of this stuff, it's also seemed quite important to me that the final thing, the established outsider relations, is again part of the way that people establish trust is obviously through familiarity. And on the internet, where you often don't have much connection with other people, small levels of familiarity become extremely multiplied. And what people tend to sort of perceive is that they tend to ignore, say, the flames by people who are established, and they tend to focus on the people who are outsiders and discipline them. Okay, it's fairly complicated, but there's always the insider-outsider thing becomes extremely intense in my experience online, and so that's something that people have to think about if they're going to use the internet for communicating with other people. Okay, so talking briefly about the mobilization of the offline. Okay, meaning and action always occurs in a context. A statement never has any meaning unless there's the context applied for it. The trouble with being online is that you always have to import your context externally to the thing. And this means quite often that cliches about the way that people should behave actually become more important in the way that you interpret the ways that people do behave. And so one of the things that I argue in the full version of this is that categories like gender, race, politics, religion and so on, depending upon where the type of list you have or the type of organization you have, become stronger online as modes of interpretation rather than weaker. That can occur irrespective of whether those divisions actually make any big difference to the way that people actually behave if you look at things. Okay, so one of the things that people do in online arguments is attempt to situate the argument being made by somebody else in terms often of their gender, often of their race, because again that is something that people can understand. Okay, I was going to talk a bit about the way that mailing lists are structured, because my main work is studying a particular mailing list. It may seem very insular just to study one mailing list, but part of the if you like, the theory behind this sort of thing is that if you study one particular thing minutely, then you get at least some idea of how that particular thing works, and then you can look at other stuff and see whether they work in all sorts of other ways. So one of the things that's notable about mailing lists is that because they're subscription-based, it tends to mean that people who are subscribed have some kind of loyalty to that particular group, especially if they've been subscribed for a long time. It doesn't always translate that case way, but it is in general. It means you've also got centralized control because it goes through one particular computer. Okay, so controlling news groups is a completely different thing from controlling mailing lists. And again, even controlling through websites where the actual builders of the website have to put the stuff on is another form of control and allows other types of editing. So you get different types of ways that people interact. But moderation on mailing lists is generally precarious because if people don't like what the moderator's decision is, they can always go somewhere else, as you know. But nevertheless, the moderation can become less precarious depending upon how that ties up with structures offline. If the moderator has some authority already within the community or within the group, which is based outside, then that is imported into the particular list. So again, lists or forums tend to reinforce power structures which are already existent rather than to subvert them in any kind of sense. Okay, one of the sort of interesting things that I found on the list was that there's a kind of problem that happens with off-topic mails, because off-topic mails are part of the way that people generate community and generate some kind of sense of the way that people on the group know each other. And yet, of course, the more that the mails go off-topic, the more that you tend to lose people. And so this is again another kind of a problem if you are actually going to use this kind of thing for communicating with people in terms of governance or whatever, because to get the group with a sense of identity, which will actually then enable it to maneuver offline, you have to somehow steer this line between the disruption of the people who want to just remain on topic. Okay. Okay, another sort of important thing, again, which has been discussed a lot, is the idea of the problem of volume. It's all very easy to say that politicians don't want to answer people's emails, but the problem is how on earth do you actually answer 300 emails a day or whatever you get. But this can also mean if you actually have some kind of, it can also mean that people have a short attention span because there's an extremely large volume of mails that will be presented to them, which they can then sort of get lost in. The mail is constantly coming in and burying topics so that things get lost. But the volume of the mail also tends to influence the way that people see the group, because again the group does not exist other than as in text. So when there's a particular volume of a type of mail or a style of mail, what I've called ambient, then people tend to construct a group as if that group is what the ambience is. If there's a lot of flame going on at the moment, people may associate the group as being aggressive or whatever. Okay. But it also means that because of this volume thing, that participation within a group is also not a guarantor of democracy or whatever you want to say, because it doesn't give any kind of coherence, because you get a whole lot of different presentations. You don't actually get to reply to people because of the volume and so on. It doesn't mean that you get listened to, because again, because of the volume. And it also undermines what seems to be a sort of general idea that there can be some kind of reflective discourse naturally occurring on the list, because it gets volume buried in the volume, because also the volume, the flaming, the lack of being and so on tend to undermine any kind of what you might call rational procedures, but you know, that doesn't particularly matter. Okay, I was going to talk about what happens on a particular list the list that I've been studying. I'll only go through this very briefly. I've only got a few minutes. This particular event happened just after it became obvious that George Bush was going to go into Iraq, about the middle of the year before it happened. And one of the things that happened on this particular list was that debate split extremely heavily on national lines. Even the Americans who actually opposed George Bush tended to think that those people who were not American, who were attacking American policy, were anti-American rather than anti-George Bush. One of the things that doesn't vanish online is nationality. Okay, if it becomes salient, then it becomes like gender and race and so on. It becomes more relevant to the way that people argue rather than less relevant. And the ways that the group tried to deal with this, in fact, was through a whole series of one-line jokes, which just kept issuing and issuing and issuing. And one of the problems with that was, of course, that it drove away large numbers of people who weren't interested in one-line jokes. So again, you have the problem that the way the list tried to build community spontaneously actually undermined the being of the list. And since this has actually occurred, the list is, in my opinion, sort of slowly going into sort of a death phase. But again, you can't just say, oh, it's a death phase, we don't need to study it anymore. Because that also teaches you about how people get into that kind of state, what you can do about it, if possible. Okay, so what happened in the middle of all this, while there was an extremely number of great fragmentation happening, was that somebody wrote a mail about how a girlfriend of theirs had an affair with a black American, and when she went to America, she found out, she made love with him and came back, and then got an email saying, ha ha ha, there were 4 of us, and we just fucked you, and that's it. And she wrote about this, and someone objected to this as being a racist email, okay, and you can see the reason and logic for that. But one of the interesting ways that the debate went was that it became a struggle about how you situated this email. Was it an email about race, or was it an email about the well-known internet phenomenon of love and abuse and abandonment and betrayal? Okay, so the struggle came over a situation again. Was it a racial thing, or was it about how men behave in general? Okay, so again, because I don't have time to go through this, but it was interesting that the whole way that race and gender were mobilized meant that people were consistently misreading each other's mails. They would see people as coming from particular positions which were not actually within their males. And the only way you can tell this is when you know a lot of the people who've been involved for a long time. Okay, and one of the ways ultimately the argument seemed to be resolved, or at least sidelined, was that it became sort of the way the argument went was that it was assumed by people, including everybody, that gender transcended race, that gender became a way that people organised each other, which was more important than race. Race fragmented people, and gender joined people together. So it was sort of, the argument went along the lines like, okay, there may be racial differences, but the gender similarities overpower those. Now, I'm not saying that that's anything particular that occurs all the way through. Okay, and if I have more time, I would go into the more concentrated aspects of this. But it is simply a way of showing that these categories, which are important offline, also are imported into arguments online and actually shape the course of the argument and become part of the rhetoric that decides how an argument will proceed, as influenced by the structural ways that you can communicate, the ways that power can be used, and also finally by the existential factors of how it is when you are online.
Okay, let's get some light in here. Okay, don't ask me to link. Questions to Bob, Peter, or John? Down the front here. Okay, the question, if you want to come up here, Peter, for the webcasting, is the question is basically whether the electoral database can be linked up with other commercial databases for commercial reasons or whatever, I think is the gist.
Yeah, sure. The short answer is I don't know, but my limited IT understanding of it is that they electronically get the AEC information and they already mix that in with telephone directory information and so forth. So I'm assuming that their IT whizzes could do something about that, but I actually just don't know. Yeah.
Up the back there.
Yes, a question for Bob, please. He's spoken of the need for forums for centralised government and community input, and he's quoted the Victoria situation as exemplar. I wonder whether you can tell us what is actually happening by way of forums in Victoria or what it is.
Do you want to just repeat that as you understand?
Yes, the question is about Victorian experience with providing forums for discussing how technology is used not only within government but outside. Have I got that right? Yeah. I have to say I'm a bit of a fraud here because I haven't taken this as far as I would like. As far as I've taken it is to track the debates as far as one can from outside government within Canada very recently and Victoria over a few years and see where they've got. And what is very clear is that within both the Canadian government and within the current Victorian government, things with regard to the management of ICT have been brought to a peak where political interest, bureaucratic leadership and technical expertise and managerial expertise are fused more tightly than perhaps they've been in the past. My question then is, well, if you're doing that within government and people outside government are looking for different things, is there a reason for you to be open within government to what's happening outside? should you be asking the question, how can we talk to other people, and especially, how can we listen to people who are not part of our peak government conversation? That's as far as I've gone. Thank you for your comment. I think you're on the money.
Was there a question just a bit further down here? Yeah.
To say that your suggestion of members of Parliament being subject to FOI is quite a novel one. MPs subject to the capacities of the Parliament, the Secretary, the correspondence to the government departments subject to FOI. With respect to the capacity of the private member, I would suggest that my capacity to go to Parliament for 3 weeks receiving information security and to leave Parliament is something that is really subject to FOI. Judge constraints somehow I have to do the voters actually capacity to operate freely in the Parliament.
Do you want to paraphrase that and then sort of respond?
Yes. Look, I completely agree, and I guess I probably wasn't clear. I would only be talking about people being able to access their own information on your database. So, you know, me being able to access if I live in your electorate, me being able to access what you have about me on the database, not me being able to access anything else through your office. Yeah, absolutely. I'd be only talking about that sort of personal level issue through your database.
Up the back there. I hope this is a question for John. Oh, Bob.
There is a lot of rhetoric around the centralised government in Victoria and the reaching out. And I work for BigNet, which has done all the community development work next to the IT. They're doing the main region in Victoria. Now this new central office, the same office, has not come to us and said, okay, let's get support. I actually met the guy at the conference and he walked away from me. And I wasn't rude or anything. But the other shocking thing, Bob said that one of the messages I got from the talk was that there needs to be a stronger link between community and government. And BigNet has been the main vehicle, one of the main vehicles for doing that. And I had a phone call this morning to say, that section of BigNet, the section that I work in, that we're all going to be made redundant. There's a lot of contributions there.
Do you want to sort of paraphrase?
Thank you. The comment is that there are a lot of contradictions, and there is a lot of tension between the current leadership at the centre in Victoria and what's happening in BigNet, which has been around and very visible in Victorian communities for a very long time. And the punchline was that there is a bit of bureau shuffling and a bit of job abolition going on. Well, first of all, my sympathy. We've all been there. We've all been good ideas that have become someone's idea of a bad idea. So, at a personal and official level, my sympathy for that. Moving away from the particular case, I think what we've got here is an example of multiple ideas, multiple possibilities, and the difficulty of keeping all the planets in orbit. And if anything has come through my reading of Jane Fountain's work and of other people on how organisations and technology intermesh, is that on the one hand there is this let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's all do our own thing. On the other hand, there are the people who, whether they like it or not, are what Manning Clark called the straighteners. They're the people who hammer things out. And the more I hear about the management of IT now, the more my own experience when I was in government quite some time ago is reflected. There is a lot of hammering out going on, and so there's a big disjunction between the individual liberty and expansion of opportunity that we might think we can do through using online means and how we organise it. And the core of my concern was the very people who are trying to organise a nice public face are caught right in the middle of a dilemma. And I think in this example you've brought home, in a very nice, unfortunately for you, very poignant case, the pinprick of the dilemma. And I'm saying to people in government and in the community, there are going to be lots of pinpricks, and some of them may be sword thrusts. So get yourself organised now.
John.
Jonathan, question about your ideas around authenticity. I'd like to know what evidence you have for the existence of that as an issue online, and perhaps say a little more about what the specific evidence of that being concerned to is.
Okay, so the question is about what evidence do I have for my statements about people and authenticity. Okay, all I can say to that is that the evidence comes out of a large degree of experience on different kinds of forum, okay, and also looking at what people are actually doing on those forums as opposed to what they're saying they do. And quite often you'll find that people say they're extremely relaxed about this sort of stuff, but in fact the way they behave doesn't indicate any relaxation about it whatsoever. And particularly if you engage with them in off list or whatever, interviews or phone or face-to-face, it often gets people, that people will say different things then than they will say online. Okay, so as I say with all of my things, I can't actually say that this is true everywhere. All I can say is that it's true in the experience that I've had, or at least as true as I can make sure it is. And also, of course, one of the things was that it surprised me, because I also started off thinking, oh, well, everybody's going to be sort of playing around with their identities. It's all going to be this postmodern, freeform, being multiple self stuff. But in fact, it wasn't. But it did vary from type of forum to other type of forum. For instance, on the mailing list I studied, people were extremely careful to try and find out who each other were, and that they wanted the person to be presenting a genuine picture. And they would get if somebody, for instance, did a multiple personality thing and put forward one argument one day and another argument the other day, then people would pick them up for that sort of thing. But if, for instance, it was on a moo or something like that, where in fact there is kind of more props to keep up fictitious identities, then people would be more relaxed about it. But nevertheless, whenever they were trying to have some kind of intimate relationship or relationship that went beyond just brief exchanges, then they would definitely try and find out more about the other person. And that would involve all kinds of elaborate procedures, from talking to other people, from trying to talk to people in authority on the moo and find out where somebody came from, even though that wasn't supposed to ever be revealed, and so on. So it just seemed to be something that occurred wherever I was. So that's the evidence that I have, okay.
We might just go over here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Can I extrapolate from my talk to e-government? Okay. My general argument is that it's all very well for us to say, okay, that we can use the internet to extend democracy, or we can use the internet to make government more friendly to people. We can use the internet to gain information from people via the internet. We can use the internet to connect other people. But the trouble is that unless you actually know how people go about organising themselves online and what are the phenomena of being organised online, you have no idea whether what you are doing will actually have the effects that you want. So I think, for instance, if you are thinking about, sort of as a politician, getting people involved with your campaign or your particular ideas, then you really want to know, okay, what is the best forum for doing this? What kind of things should I look at? Now, at the moment, I'm still saying, okay, it's a bit of a mystery, but I think you have to look at the way that communication is organised. You have to look at how control is exerted within that particular forum. You have to look at the consequences of control. You have to look at the way that things die, the way that things get distracted. And one of the things that I say, I'm an anthropologist, and one of the things that I say that makes, that if I was to define what's different about an anthropologist and a political scientist or a sociologist, is that anthropologists are interested in the things that everybody else considers to be junk. We're actually interested in garbage because you can't run a society without garbage. Okay, and what people do with garbage is really important. Okay, and so you look at all the things that don't work. You look at, okay, every study there's ever been by an anthropologist of a political organisation has always shown that what people say they do is radically different from what they do. Now that may not be a big deal, but you then start looking at the way that those two sorts of things interact with each other. And so, like with the authenticity stuff, okay, there's all this stuff about freedom and so on the internet. Well, that, as far as I could see, doesn't work, but it sets up an interesting sort of set of paradoxes about the way that people will use their authenticity and the way that it will undermine certain types of things that they do. For instance, it's often said that you can only be who you are when you're online because you don't have any physical anchors or whatever. So one of the things that I got interested in was the way that people use that sort of thing when they're having net sex with other people, which politicians hopefully will not do, okay. But nevertheless, okay, I'm an anthropologist, we look at the irrelevant stuff. Okay, but what happened was that people, to make contact, to make the contact more genuine, they would actually have to exaggerate the cliches. Like, for instance, you know, if you were a woman, you talked about how big your breasts were and how your hips were wobbling and all that sort of stuff, and there's a guy who talks about all sorts of the way that you were marked. But that may have absolutely nothing to do with you. So at the same time as using the internet to be who you were kind of, by the necessity of play, undermining your sense of genuineness about who you were. So people got incredibly involved in oh, it's, you know, this is a really intense relationship, but it's a fantasy, and not knowing where they were. Okay? So, as I say, this doesn't have much to do with politics, but you may find that the same kind of thing happens in political things. That to say who you are, you have to exaggerate who you are to such an extent that you no longer are who you are. Okay, and again, that becomes in arguments. I mean, it would always split. I never have been in an internet argument which actually came to the resolution where people actually held different opinions to when they started. Okay, it would always tend to split, to get more and more exaggerated as people sort of said who they were by exaggerating who they were. And often you'd find, you'd talk to the people after the argument, and they'd say, oh, well, that's not really what I meant. But, you know, that's how the argument came over. And you have to know things like that if you're going to use the internet as a form, the internet to involve a form of governance, or whether it's involvement with the state or whether it's people regulating themselves. Okay?
And another one.
I'm interested in your role of participant and researcher.
Yeah.
I'd like to comment on whether they deal with each other.
Okay, I've been on this particular list since December 1994. Okay, the list started in mid-1994. So what initially happened for me was that I wrote to the moderator and said, look, I want to do research, and this looks like a really good list to do it because you talk about irrelevant stuff all the time, so consequently I can get to know the people. I don't have the same problems that a lot of people studying things where they don't actually know anything about the people, because people have revealed huge amounts about themselves over a long period of time. So I know about the social distribution of education and all of that kind of stuff on this list. Okay, and he said to me, well, I'm really worried, you know, when everybody knows you're a researcher, they're all going to shut up. Okay, so I said, well, okay, that's a bit of a problem. And so he said, well, just hang around and see what happens. So I became a list member, and then about 6 months later he said, look, I mean, you know, it's obviously, this is not a problem. And ever since then it's been kind of totally overt that I am the list anthropologist, if you like. All of the stuff I write goes onto a website so that people can read it, and hopefully people sometimes comment on it, sometimes just tell me it's a load of rubbish, which is great, because, you know, that gives me more information. And my current project is actually a sort of an attempt to do a multi-voiced ethnography, so that lots of different people write about their experiences and write about the way that other people have analysed their experiences. So it's not just me telling everybody how this list works, but it's the list themselves as well. And obviously I'm going to provide the commentary on the final editor, so I have slightly more power. But it hasn't, in this case, ever really seemed to cause that much more of an observer paradox than otherwise. And one of the other things I've noticed is that sometimes on this list people have come in and not told anybody that they were doing analysis. And that has usually caused quite a lot of disruption. People have felt betrayed and upset and got quite vitriolic about it. But because everybody knows who I am, and my politics are extremely overt, you know, there's no real surprises, and I've never had anybody object, at least to my face, and no one has. And they're a very full-on group of people, so they would, I think. Only in the sense that it always does. I mean, you end up knowing stuff about people which is probably secret. Also, it's probably being given to you for some kind of political reason. They know that you're the anthropologist. So they say, oh, what can we say to undermine this person? But I don't think that that's more of a problem than it is for any other kind of research. I mean, if you have any contact with people, as opposed to just doing questionnaires and statistics, you are going to be part of the manipulation and part of the political process, okay? And all I can say again is that my role in the political process of the list is very overt, and it doesn't seem to cause that much of an issue, and I've certainly always been, whenever I've been given private information, which is really interesting, I've always made sure that it was retold, if you like, in a way that made it completely unidentifiable, or sometimes, unfortunately, I've just said, oh, I just can't do that, no matter how interesting it is. Okay.
Up the back there.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is about, is there a way of discussion groups not reinforcing their own power structures or being more open about the power structures? Yeah, okay. I think the answer to that is yes, but I think the other problem with it is that it's a long-term kind of thing. I think that's what's more of a worry for me, is that discussion groups reinforce external power structures, because that's the only way that they can be implemented is through already existing social phenomena. So I would be extremely I'd be more like, I mean, somebody asked a question here earlier today about prominence of left or right-wing ideology online, okay? And a research I saw recently, but unfortunately I can't remember who wrote it, was that there was an awful lot more left-wing activity, but there was an awful lot more right-wing websites. Okay, which is, and from a naive point of view, is what you'd expect, okay, because the right-wing has all the money. Okay, so but that in a way is sort of goes back to the thing that because the resources are available offline means that they become magnified online, and it doesn't sort of almost may not matter what people do online, because the way that you translate anything is still got to be offline. Online action, as the Howard Dean campaign, etc., shows, doesn't really translate into anything. It has to translate into offline stuff. So you need, so the power structures that exist already may be much more important. I think that the actual power structures within online groups are very precarious. Okay, and are often quite challengeable simply because people can go elsewhere. There's no, and unless, of course, there is an offline reason why they have to belong to a particular forum, then they can go elsewhere and the place will just be empty and they can start up their own. So it's not, so the power structures online tend to dissolve if unless they actually do reflect the group. In that way, they are kind of semi-democratic because nobody will turn up if they don't like it. Okay, but that doesn't mean anything at all about them challenging the offline power structures. Is that roughly, yeah? Okay.
Any more questions, or people are hungry? Well, I'd like to thank our presenters for a diverse set of papers, which finally, I think, in some ways might have actually gelled together. Okay, thanks very much.